Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. On today's show, back by popular demand, one of the guests with the most popular episode of all time Purity Culture, we have Mylee. Welcome back, Mylee.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be on again.
Yeah, I'm stoked. Last time you were on, we talked a lot about Purity Culture, and people had a lot of positive response to it. They felt like it was just a very simple overview that was very clear, especially for people who maybe didn't grow up in it. So I'm looking forward to this kind of even more niche topic when it comes to Christianity. We're going to talk about suffering. I feel like it's something you and I do a lot of. so I feel like we're qualified to speak on suffering.
Yeah.
When you were a Christian, what came to your mind when you heard the word suffering?
I thought of suffering as both inevitable as a Christian. I mean, as a human, but mainly I thought of it through the lens of Christianity. Of course, Christians are going to suffer because Jesus suffered. And I also thought of it as something that was like a badge of honor, like whoever suffered the most, especially for Christianity's cause, was like the best Christian, like the closest to God that you could be. So I had what I now think is kind of like an unhealthy view of it, where like I kind of wanted suffering because I thought that would somehow elevate my status and bring me closer to Jesus.
Yeah, do you know what age that thought was conceptualized? Was that something that was very gradual that you kind of solidified in adult life, or was that something you believed from a young age? Do you recall?
Yeah, I think it was something that I didn't really fully understand until I was in high school. In high school, I went on my first mission trip, and I also in high school I was just like hella depressed all the time, which like now I look back on it and I'm like, okay, well, of course I was depressed. I was like getting really, really into this whole like suffering for Jesus kind of thing. So yeah, when I was in high school is really when that started to crystallize in my mind as like, okay, this is something that like it's a good and holy thing to suffer. So like I shouldn't try to avoid it or run away from it. Like I should embrace it and laud people when they do suffer.
Did you so you say that was a mission trip mostly? Were there other people in the churches you went to who were suffering or how I'll phrase it actually this way. How often were people using the word suffering in the Christian cultures you were around?
So there was a lot of talk about martyrdom. Um, I was raised reading biblical books like Revelation, where there's just a lot of crazy stuff going on and a lot of suffering, like prophesied to come. And so I think I was just hearing those narratives so much that it was just always on my mind. Like I think the concept of martyrdom, especially because when I prepared to go to my mission trip, I was thinking about death a lot because part of me had this idea in my mind, probably because of the narratives that I had heard surrounding martyrdom, that people who went to like Africa, I went to Uganda for the mission trip, people who went to Africa and suffered for the cause and were killed because of their beliefs. Like, I don't know, that was just some narrative that was in my mind. So as me, being a 16-year-old who was preparing to go on an excursion like this, I was just thinking to myself in the months leading up to it, like, well, what if I die? And so that was just something that was really kind of morbidly just always on the front of my mind around that time.
Yeah, that's been something I've kind of very recently just kind of, religious trauma is such a like complex thing that sometimes you like find this element of your personality and you're like, oh, shoot, I haven't actually like dug into that and
Mm,
like explored that. But that's the idea that I was ready to die for something before I was even an adult. Like that's been something I've been thinking about.
yeah.
It's kind of wild that you're like prepared to die for something as a teenager.
Yeah.
And it just kind of highlights the cult nature of it all.
Mm.
And be ready to suffer for it, right? Like that it wasn't just like willing to die. It wasn't just like jump in front of the bullet mentality. It was actually kind of like darker than that. It was almost like how some soldiers might talk about being willing to be tortured rather than give up information. It's almost like you have a similar mentality in defending your faith. Did you feel similar to that?
Absolutely. Like, it was a noble thing to defend. Yeah, I had heard stories about, people like Elizabeth Elliot, like, whose husband died, I think it was in South America at the hands of a tribe that they were trying to convert, or like what was the name of that book? Oh, She Said Yes, about the Columbine shooting, um, where somebody was asked, like, "Do you believe in God?" And then they were shot if they did. And so, like, it was just painted as this, yeah, this noble thing, like, and the parallels to, like, nationalism are striking, actually, that, you'd, if it's so noble, if you'd be willing to give your life for this cause, almost to a cheeky kind of point, like, somebody ask me, come on, ask me if I believe in Jesus and then shoot me. Like, it was just, yeah, it was a bunch of stories of grandeur. And it is weird. It's so weird to think back at that mindset that I had as a 16-year-old.
Right. It's not normal, right? Like that is like that's a strange thing to be to not only be thinking about but be rather preoccupied with.
Mm.
How about your firsthand experiences of suffering as a Christian? Uh, we'll stick with how you thought about your firsthand experiences with suffering and give as many examples as you want. Feel free not to share anything you don't. But when you think about any times of life where you were suffering when you were a Christian, what was your mindset about it?
Yeah. Again, my mindset was kind of the same, which in one way I think was positive, that I was just kind of accepting that, like, yep, of course, people are going to suffer. And even if it wasn't directly related to my faith, like, for example, my health problems, I would just use, I would just use my faith as a way to kind of cope with those problems and say, like, okay, well, I was guaranteed suffering. It says that in the Bible. And it seems kind of just obvious that humans are going to suffer. So I just accepted it and I used my faith as a coping mechanism for it. And it just kind of made me talk even more about it, and made me lean even more into, like, the evangelical side of my faith and, like, sharing things with others. But yeah, I think a lot of my suffering, I don't mind talking about the specific things. Like, for example, my chronic health problems. I was really sick for a few years. When we were in Bible college together in our junior year, I had to drop out because, um, my health problems were really, really bad, and I didn't have any diagnoses. I had no idea what was going on. I had to leave my jobs. I had to leave my school. I had to leave my church. I moved across the country to go see doctors in Chicago. Um, and so that for me was a time, I would say, of heavy suffering. And it was a physical suffering. But then also there's mental and emotional suffering when you have chronic health problems. That's enormous. So for me, during that time, um, I continued to see suffering the same way. Like I said, I thought of suffering as kind of, I think, a badge of honor, and I don't think I would have said that back then. I don't think I would have said to people, like, "Yeah, look at me, I'm such a good Christian because I'm suffering and I'm still dealing with it with grace and being, still a good Christian." But that was kind of how I saw it, in my mind. Um, that I'm going through something and that kind of makes me a little bit superior to others. Again, I would not have said that at the time.
Well, yeah, it's funny because I remember praying for you in class when you had left, which is kind of a wild thing to think about. but yeah, there were. I think about Bible college a lot because, we have a mutual friend who she actually eventually passed away.
Hmm.
But she suffered a lot. And I remember it being almost like there felt like there was almost something healthy about like this kind of sharing in the suffering. Like it felt like everyone was kind of willing to take an emotional load of um anyone who was suffering in our community, right? Like it felt very much like in the positive way, it felt very empathetic, right? It felt like if one of us is hurting, we're all hurting.
Yeah.
But it at the same time, unfortunately, felt kind of performative.
Hmm.
um it didn't really feel like something. It didn't always like it wasn't always a call to action, I guess. You know what I mean? Like it didn't really feel like there was ever much done for people who were suffering. At
Hmm.
least in that context. There's some church stories I can remember us rallying like in practical ways for people who were suffering. But at Bible college it felt very performative and very theologized.
Yes.
Like it
Yeah.
was like we have to picture this in the grand scheme of theology. So when you're having health problems amidst like studying the Bible and studying theology, did you feel like it all had to be kind of like worded in that kind of context, or was there like a specific kind of word choice or cadence you felt like you were following when you were suffering?
Absolutely. I felt 100% like I was not allowed to complain. Like I was not allowed to, you know, really share like how horrible I was feeling because and if I did, I had to drop in there like, but God is still good. I would say that all the time. I had a blog for a little bit. I'm pretty sure I've deleted it so that it's gone forever. I don't know. No, actually, I think I did save it. But I had a blog during the time that I was sick, and I would always put God is good um, at the end of every single blog post. And if I started it off with like some kind of complaining or some kind of like, I think this is unfair, then I would always have to follow it up with, but God is still good through all of it. And I really did believe that, but it was like I had to kind of like hype myself up to believe that because raw in the moment was like, no, this shit sucks. Like, this is horrible. Why is this happening to me? I'm so confused. I'm so lonely. I'm so lost. But what I felt like I could say to others was, this is the way it is. And guess what? I still believe that God is on the throne. So, yeah, I definitely felt there was a pressure on how to deal with suffering as a Christian because as Christians, we knew so much about suffering through, reading about the story of Jesus that like we should be like, in the Olympics of suffering, we should be the winners where we're like, we know how this goes. We're closest to the person who's suffered the most. So I felt like there was always that need for an addendum like, yeah, this kind of sucks, but like, hey, God is still good and you should still accept him as your Lord and Savior.
Wow. There's many things that come to mind. One is there's a very recently published book called The Cult of the Dead, A Brief History of Christianity, by Kyle
Mhm.
Smith, who's a religious professor. I'm almost done with it. And yeah, he kind of talks about the origins of Christianity are kind of like uh for lack of a better word, sadistic, almost like there
Mhm.
was really like this, like the sharing and the suffering was so central to the cult.
Mhm.
um and what's funny is, did you take the class Theology of Suffering at Moody?
No, I did not.
So I took a class where that was literally called Theology of Suffering with the favorite professor of you and I when we went there.
Mhm.
Um and it was actually like really good. Like overall, like I still look back on some of what I learned in that class and was like, some of this is really solid. Um and one of the reasons that class was solid is, ironically, we didn't actually talk about too much theology. We just talked a lot about suffering as a topic.
Mhm.
And one of the things I took away one of the first days, uh, the professor put three circles in like a Venn diagram setup, and he said there's three problems of evil. He said there's the personal problem of evil, which is why is something bad happening to me?
there's the philosophical problem of evil, which is why does evil exist? And then there's the theological problem of how could a good God cause suffering? And the reason that was actually really helpful for me at the time, and I still think in those categories sometimes, is he said, if someone comes up to you and they're suffering, figure out which problem they're actually dealing with, or if it's a combination, because sometimes they're if they're a Christian, they might not be dealing with the theological issue. If they're not a Christian, they probably don't care about the theological issue. So just try to like understand where people are coming from. And I think that was really helpful. But what's funny is it took a class on that in a Christian culture for me to like really understand that. Before that class, I felt similar. Like it all had to be like contextualized in like a theological framework. So I find that interesting in your story that you almost had to say God is good. It kind of reminds me of like toxic positivity. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yes, 100%. It was very toxically positive, and not just on my end, but on other people's end, because people would come to me and they would say all sorts of things. And see, I didn't really get upset at it when it was me doing the toxic positivity. I didn't really realize it as an issue, but when others would do it, I did realize it as an issue. Not necessarily an issue as much as it just really pissed me off. So for example, if somebody would come up to me and say, "Oh, you look like you're doing better," when I really didn't, I'm like, okay, I know they're just trying to like be nice, but like, yeah, I learned how to put makeup over my dark circles. That's why I look this way, but I actually still feel like shit. Or people would say like, well, at least it's not cancer. And that was one huge thing. And I actually talked about that when I wrote my blog too. And like, again, it was, laced with grace and, God is still good and blah, blah, blah. But I was kind of like, hey, maybe we stop saying that to people who don't have cancer, but who are suffering. Yeah, because it definitely felt like toxic positivity. Although I don't know if I would have had the verbiage to put it that way back then, because I didn't really have any like psychological background. I hadn't like studied psychology. I hadn't gone to therapy. So like I didn't have these phrases to describe what was going on, because instead of, seeing suffering through a psychological lens, my experience was to only view it through a religious lens. Um, and again, like I wish I would have taken theology of suffering because I heard amazing things about that class, and obviously, like we love that professor. Um, but no, I think all of my learning about suffering it came from religion, and all the ways that I knew to cope with suffering were from religion. I mean, suffering only had as a Christian, in my experience, there was only really one good light at the end of the tunnel, and that was heaven. That was something that really got me through my sickness. Is like, well, the worst that can happen is I die, and then I go to heaven. So that's actually amazing. Um, and there was only one coping mechanism with suffering, and that was, trust God or pray, like lean into that religion. So both the solution and like the way to cope with it, I only saw those in religious terms. I didn't see them in like psychological terms or neurological terms or anything like that.
Yeah, it's all presented in such a like it's not even presented in a very like exploratory way. It's kind of like we figured it out. So if you're suffering, here you go. And yeah, it does not bring as like I know it has brought some people some hope and comfort, and I don't want to like take that away from anybody, but for me personally, it always sat as kind of hand waving, like kind of like ultimately none of this matters because when we die, that's when everything will be made right. And so you have this weird kind of hope for death.
Yeah.
Um and that's kind of dark when you really start to think about it. So
Mhm.
so last time we talked about how you walked away from Christian faith. So when you hear the word suffering now, what comes to mind? Is it any different than when you were a Christian?
Yes. There are some things that I still think that Christianity has like some good things to teach about suffering, but I do see it very different now, because I have just like a wider view of it rather than seeing it just through the lens of religion and the end goal, the end game of heaven. I I see it for like what it truly is, which is something that's inevitable, I think, for all humans, something that is extremely varied in intensity and scope, and something that we definitely shouldn't avoid because it's going to happen. So something that it can't be avoided. I also don't see it as something that we should really try to obtain more of. Of course, I know there are people who, purposely will do things to like kind of train themselves to be okay with suffering. I mean, I don't know. I think ice baths are a way for people to like just give themselves suffering, and I know that happens a lot. But anyway, um I personally don't see it as like it's not a badge of honor. It's just something that's inevitable, and um that it is something that we can cope with. Humans have an extreme ability to adapt and to self-soothe and to community soothe. And yeah, I think I just have a much broader, more accepting view of suffering now, but not where I put it up on a pedestal as the best thing that can happen. Now I'm more focused on how, for me personally at least, how I can cope with it, how I can help others cope with it. Um, yeah.
I just kind of had one of those moments where there was a specific phrase you said that I don't think I've ever heard those words put that way, and it kind of blew my mind, even though it's so simple. Um, you just said that humans can cope with suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just funny, as a 28-year-old man who, grew up in what I call a cult, I've never really even heard that phrase and like been like, wow, yeah, I believe that, but like I've never articulated that in my life. So thank you for that. That's pretty powerful, actually, to even, that's such a shift of paradigm from what I grew up in. Because I was taught that you can't cope with suffering without God. Let's broaden this a little more. Suffering, generally, definition, boring. It's undergoing pain, distress, or hardship. And that could be emotional, physical, financial suffering. It's a whole range of pain. You've already alluded to, you think all humans suffer at some point. In the United States, do you think that's true? I mean, we have these concepts of privilege. Does everyone suffer at some point? And what are some of the more common ways that all people suffer, maybe?
Two things. First, I do believe that everybody suffers, that it's kind of just like a human, something to be expected. It's just kind of a given. But number two, I just want to say I do realize that in this country, our suffering looks different than many countries. We do have an immense amount of privilege in that, a lot of us here speak English. A lot of us here are wealthy, at least, relatively wealthy based on like the rest of the world. We don't really have things like famine and war that come to our soil. We are like a very, I would say, given, even with all of our problems here in this country, like we're a very like peaceful and free country. Again, I know that there's a lot of like, exceptions to that, and things are not all rosy, but I do want to clarify that yes, we do have it really good here in the United States in a lot of ways that a lot of other countries do not. However, I think suffering is more than just, starving and war and starving. It's just those are big things that are obviously, yes, those are suffering, but there's so many other ways to suffer. And I don't think any ways of suffering are invalid. So, saying that, I keep on thinking of, for example, celebrities. You think about these celebrities who, okay, well, they're not suffering because they're unattractive, because they are attractive. They're not suffering because they have health problems, because unless they're silent about it, okay, they're in good shape. They're not suffering financially, obviously, because they have all the money in the world. They're not suffering, for fame or whatever, because they have that. But yet we still see so many celebrities with such deep psychological problems, and health problems as well. I don't know. I think that as an entire globe, we hold celebrities up to the status of they have it good. But there's just case after case after case of celebrities that end up ending their own lives, whether accidentally or purposefully, because obviously they are suffering in some way. So I don't think it matters how good of a life you have on the surface or in writing. you're still going to suffer. So that applies to everybody, including everyone here in the United States.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, celebrities, especially when you get into like child stars and stuff, it's such a good example of like, there's certainly certainly privilege is not a way of escaping suffering, right? Like it doesn't just safeguard you from ever experiencing harm. And I think that's important to bring up in both discussions, both when you talk about dismantling privilege and talking about like, or maybe not even dismantling privilege, but creating equality. Like, I think that's a relevant thing to talk about in that conversation and in this conversation. Because I think, dealing with what's really happening is better than just what it appears or but I even feel it right now, like the idea that it's very clear some suffer more than others, right? Like, I can be in debt in this country and still buy food. I mean, that alone is a privilege, right? um there's definitely like levels of suffering, but just because some suffer more than others, I get so uncomfortable when we start talking about ranking trauma because it just feels strange to me. So when is it helpful to point out the differences in our levels of suffering, and when is it harmful?
I That's kind of a hard question, because on one hand, I don't think it's helpful at all to point out the differences in our suffering because that just serves to tear people apart and create divides between people and some kind of competition between people. So on one hand, yeah, I think it's mostly harmful, but then um, I think it can also be, obviously good for your perspective if you point out differences in suffering. So, for example, if you're, I don't know, I've heard this so many times, like if your kid at the table, they don't want to eat their broccoli, okay? They're suffering because they really don't want to eat that broccoli. They're not hungry for it. It's gross. But then when parents point out, well, there are starving children in Africa. So then they point out that there's a difference in suffering, and they hold up that, the starving child in Africa is, even though it's not really related to what's going on at their table right now, and they can't feed a starving child by saying that at their table right now. They point that out because they want to give the child perspective and say, actually, what you're going through isn't so bad. So we have things like that, which, to be honest, make me kind of uncomfortable still, because what that serves to do is not to point out, hey, there's other people in the world that might need your help, or that are going through something. It's not really for an education purpose. In that case, it's for the purpose of minimizing the suffering of the child. Now, again, I'm not like, I find myself too, like, well, of course, to starve is, way different than to just not want to finish your food. But I think we need to be careful, especially with children, because this is how they learn, these paradigms, and this is how they develop a sense of self in the world. So we need to be more careful about it. But it's just such a sensitive topic that it can be useful to put things in perspective, but we also need to tread pretty carefully and maybe put some qualifier in there that, like, suffering is still suffering. So for example, something that I think of often, as having a degree in anthropology, and this is kind of always at the forefront of my mind. But if you think about our human ancestors who were hunter gatherers, and there are still hunter gatherers, Homo sapiens now, but before agriculture, before industry, before all this came around, our species were exclusively hunter gatherers. And that life seems so charming to me personally. Like, we didn't have capitalism back then. Like, you just found your food, you hunted your food, you sat around the fire, you got a lot of physical activity in, so you didn't have to worry about going to the gym. The communities are really close. Like, there's just all these wonderful things. And now in modern industrialized society, we suffer so much. We have so much illness. We have just all sorts of mental health problems, physical health problems. I mean, those are mainly the ones that I think about, to be honest. But then it is good to put it in perspective and remind myself, well, the hunter gatherers had an extremely high infant mortality rate. Children would die all the time. People would die all the time. The life expectancy was way lower than it is now. Now the life expectancy is, I think, in the upper 70s, in the United States, and back then it was probably like in the 30s. There definitely were there was definitely suffering back then, but that doesn't mean that now we have it so much better because we still have suffering. It's just very different. We don't have to worry as much about dying before 30 or our children dying in childbirth or getting mauled by a bear, but we still have, people who are so depressed and so anxious that they can't function. Um, we still have physical health problems from, pollution and all that.
So many thoughts came to mind because I think that could be really central to this topic because well, first off, it just reminds me of, I say this all the time, but when you invent the ship, you invent the shipwreck. Like there is no new pure thing that ever comes about, right? Like there's always
Mhm.
unforeseen problems with whatever new thing comes along.
Right. Suffering is always inevitable. Even if we solve some of the suffering, there's going to be different kinds of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm never going to be the utopian optimist where I'm like, yeah, if we solved world hunger, there'd be no more problems. I'm like, well, it'd be great to solve world hunger because I think we should solve world hunger. But I'm not like an optimist in the sense that I think then there'll be nothing left to do. I'll be I'm like, no, that's like there's so much suffering in so many different categories. And I think one of the things that I was thinking about while you were talking is I was like, in a lot of ways my mental health was better when I was homeless living in a van, like physically suffering more than
Mhm.
I do now. But like I had less problems, so to speak. So when you're talking about hunter gatherers, I'm like, yeah, I mean, what I was worried about is can I get enough gas money to get to my next stop? And do I have enough cans of beans left? And those were
Mhm.
kind of like the two things I had to worry about that day. um, so like the simplicity of it was kind of beautiful, right? And it actually gave me the chance to be introspective, to learn to like love myself and reframe things. Whereas now it's almost like your time is so consumed. It's kind of like the suffering that comes with capitalism, right? Is it's just like your time, everyone's always after your time all the time rather than the meat inside you or whatever. Like they're after your attention. So it is different. It's maybe not that helpful to say which is better or worse. I also do like the analogy of I think it's such a good analogy of where ranking trauma gets complicated with the kid not wanting to eat the vegetables. That's such a good analogy because it, you're right. Like the kid eats their vegetables. What happens to the starving kid in a third world country? Nothing. Like nothing is, you know, given or not given, and the child isn't really responsible for that. I mean, they're 6, 7, 8 years old. What is they? It's not their fault. The colonization is not their fault, right? Like it's a weird thing to make them feel some sort of guilt for. But you're right. There is like a perspective shift that we're aiming for there, where it's like, hey, like if this is the worst thing that's happening to you, like be thankful. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can exactly pinpoint when it's helpful to point out the differences in our suffering and when it's not. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you brought up a good point. Like, gratitude can be a positive result of comparing suffering. Because let's say that child in that analogy, let's say that they then realize throughout the rest of their life, they think when they're like going through something with food, like, I don't like this food, what if they just think, like, actually, I'm thankful that I have this food because I know that there are people who are starving. I don't think that that's a negative thing. That I think that's a positive thing that can spring from kind of comparing different types of suffering is that perspective that brings gratitude.
Yeah, one last comment on that analogy. I remember when I took a mission trip to Peru, I lost my appetite for a week. And my dad actually had to have a pretty serious conversation. I was like 13, 14, and like we went out to eat somewhere and I just like took a bite and I was like, I can't eat. And he was like, "Why?" I was like, I just feel so bad. Um, and he kind of had a talk with me. He's like, you're not saving anybody by not eating. Like,
Mhm.
and so I think that sometimes like, and I think that actually does apply more broadly if you ever feel like your suffering is not valid or whatever, is to say, well, it's not that it's not valid. It's just, is it helping anybody else by like indulging the suffering, right?
Mhm.
That I think is a little bit of a healthier spin on it, where instead of just feeling bad that you have it better than someone else, but actually thinking like, like if I actually want to help people, I have to take care of myself.
Mhm.
I heard another quote recently that was like, if I win at capitalism, I exploit others, and if I lose at capitalism, I die. And I think that's another way to frame it, is it is kind of a lose-lose situation some days. So you might as well win a little bit so you don't die. And it sounds kind of brutal, but it's just kind of the reality we deal with sometimes. Let's shift the bigger, we'll get a little more specific. So I've known people to exaggerate their suffering, and I've known other people to like shut down and like not speak about how much they are suffering. And I've actually, in myself and in others, seen the same person do both things, right? Where it's like some days they're complaining and I'm like, that doesn't really sound like that big a deal, and then other days where I'm like, that's a huge deal, why aren't you complaining? um do you know, or do you have any thoughts about why that can happen, and what are some of the negatives when we're not really accurately perceiving our suffering, or if we even can accurately perceive how we're suffering?
I think that happens. I think both of those things, exaggerating suffering and shutting down and trying to ignore the suffering, they're both protective mechanisms. They're both ways that people try to cope with that suffering because we need to cope with it somehow. And if you don't know how, then those are two easy defaults. Exaggerating your suffering, I think, is protective because then you get people, it's a surefire way to get people to pity you, or at least, not, if not pity, then at least, maybe understand a little bit like, wow, you're really going through something. And that validation is something that we really want, that we really need. And we might not be able to articulate that, but by exaggerating suffering or, using hyperbole to make it seem like it's a bigger deal than it is, even as you experience it, you're hoping that somebody will grasp onto that and be like, oh, wait, this person actually really is suffering. And there's something so healing in that, in being seen in that way. So, I think that's one way that exaggerating your suffering is a protective mechanism. And shutting down, obviously, is also a protective mechanism because a lot of people who don't know how to deal with things think, I'll just ignore it. And I mean, anybody who, has studied psychology at all knows that that's not actually going to help. But in the moment, it helps, or it feels like it helps, because if you just ignore it, then, maybe it'll just go away, or maybe you won't think about it as much and it won't affect you as much. And, then you also don't have the opportunity for people to invalidate your suffering. If you pretend it's not happening, then nobody can come up to you and be like, well, at least it's not cancer, you know?
Yeah, great points. Yeah, it makes me think about a lot of things. One, the on the exaggerated side, I've done this as much as anyone does this, where I'm having a bad day, but I'm gonna make it sound like I'm having the worst day.
Mhm.
Um, and it's not like I typically don't think I'm doing anything too dramatically awful there. But I think you're right. Sometimes it's just like, can someone see me? Can someone say it's okay? It's kind of a
Mhm.
like, I'm not getting enough. It's not even attention. It's like you're saying, it's more like a validation. It's more of a just
Mhm.
sometimes it's the question, am I crazy? Is this hard? And am I good at being an adult? Am I bad at being an adult? It can feel like that. But yeah, I'm more prone to the latter though, of the man, I'm having a bad time. I don't want anyone else to be having a bad time too. So I think you're right. I think there's some protection there. But ultimately both those positions are a little dishonest, aren't they? And
Mhm.
that's not necessarily, I don't use that word in a condemning way, because I think we all kind of have little lies that we like we just need to get through the day sometimes.
Mhm.
Um but yeah, I think it can, I should say, stunt like some growth, or even make the suffering harder to get through. Do you agree, or do you think it's more complicated than that?
I definitely agree. There, there are a lot of negatives that happen when we use those two things as coping mechanisms, and one negative thing that can happen is others will misunderstand your experience, and that can affect the kind of care you get from others. If other people don't know the accurate measure of your pain, then they can't adequately help you. And that applies to like medical suffering. If you go to the doctor and you exaggerate and you say, I this is the worst pain of my life, but it's really not, then they're probably, going to try something that wouldn't actually help you, or like they're going to have inaccurate information to make a diagnosis or develop treatment. And if you go to a doctor and you say like, oh, actually it's fine, like I'm not really in that much pain. Like I've seen this happen with a lot of people, and I've done it myself, where you try to pretend that you're stronger, you want to come across as like, well, yeah, this is happening, but it's okay. When in reality, you are in a lot of pain. And in a doctor's office, it's not the place to try to play the hero. Like if you're really in pain, you can't just be like, oh yeah, it's fine, because then you're not going to get the help that you need. So I think of it in the medical sense, but also in the interpersonal sense. Like let's say that you're in a romantic relationship with somebody, and you really have a problem going on. If you don't talk to them about it, then they're not going to be able to understand you. They're not going to be able to correctly or beneficially come alongside you and support you. And the same with exaggerating your suffering. If there's the whole boy cried wolf kind of thing, where maybe you really are suffering, but because you're dishonest about it and other people pick up on that, other people stop having as much sympathy or empathy for you. So there's a whole lot of negatives that can occur, and I think it's just very common that people don't know how to accurately measure their own suffering, because they've never been taught how to even identify certain emotions or physical sensations. Self-awareness is not something that comes naturally to people. The ability to analyze your own feelings, emotions, symptoms, situations, the ability to not like stand back and just assess, okay, this is what's going on, is where a lot of this starts. Because then it's not even like they're being dishonest, it's that they don't know how to describe what's going on, but they just know that something isn't right.
That's so well said. Man, I had like an instant memory. The medical example is such a crystallized example of what you're talking about, because um when I was in the car accident back in 2021, um like I could barely walk, and then they did the like rate your pain thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't want to give too high a number because I was worried they were going to give me opioids or something. And like I
Mm-hmm.
had like, it's so funny, I don't know which trauma it was, or if it was all compounded. I don't know if it was my religious indoctrination. I don't know if it was because I'm a man, I'm supposed to be tough. I don't know what, cultural indoctrination I was relying on, but I was like, oh, like maybe a 6. And they kind of laughed at me. They're like, we have to ask, but you're at a 10. like they're like, you have like 4 broken bones. Like you're allowed to be in a lot of pain right now. Um
Yeah.
and I was in a lot of pain, but I was trying to tell myself that I wasn't, and it wasn't really helping me doing that. And it's like, who am I trying to perform for here, right? Like like what? The doctor's going to be like, "Wow, that's the toughest patient I've ever had." What? Like what am I what am I going for there? And yeah, it just goes to show that, like you said, I think a lot of it is just not knowing how to communicate when you're in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And also, like you said, self-awareness. Like I try to, I'm convinced now, the older I get, that I'm like, oh, denial isn't like a deep-seated like psychological issue. Most people's default is just to be in denial about things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sad, and I don't know if that's just part of the human condition that we need to get better at addressing, or if there's like societal things that are contributing to that. Um Let me ask you this. Do you think some people are just unlucky, or put another way, why do you even like, why is it that some people suffer more than others? Even, and I'm not even talking about just like privilege stuff. I mean like, same social status, same socioeconomic status, same gender, whatever. Like, why do some people suffer so much more than other people sometimes?
This I think is a really complicated question, because in order to answer it, you have to define what it means to suffer more or suffer less. Um, so is it an external thing? Like, I think like what you're getting at with this question is, like, why do some like bad things happen more to certain
Right.
people?
Yeah, because earlier we already talked about how like ranking trauma in general, how it's experienced, is kind of weird. But yeah, I'm talking more like, it's like, well, some people like they have those Job stories, right? Where you just like hear their story and you're like, what on earth? Like everything that can go wrong can go wrong. It seems to be random. Like I haven't seen any kind of pattern to it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's, I mean, just to kind of like go along with the cult of Christianity theme, I think that's something that that people with a religious viewpoint, like they really get hung up on this is like, well, if I'm such a good person or if I'm doing everything right, like why am I suffering more? Or like why is, this person over here who's a horrible person not having anything bad happen to them? And that has a lot to do with value judgments. Like, what's good and what's bad. And at the end of the day, I mean, we've talked about this, I think, like at least personally, better slash worse or good slash evil, those are all made up, arbitrary, subjective modifiers. So really it depends on what worldview you're seeing it through. But I mean, to answer the question, like why do some bad things just happen more to certain people? I don't really think that there's an answer. I mean, some people, maybe make poor decisions that just invite more suffering. So if somebody lives like a more risky lifestyle, whatever, but a lot of the time that's not the case. A lot of the time, like the Job story, like Job specifically didn't do anything. It's not like he went out and gambled and bungee jumped and all that and then had accidents because of it. Like things just kept on going wrong and he couldn't really do anything about it. So yeah, I think that those external, ways of suffering, I don't think there's really any rhyme or reason to it. Again, unless you would believe in some kind of like religious system or even not like religious like Christianity, but like some kind of like, karma, things like that. If you have a worldview that allows for that, then you can make a little bit of sense for it. Which I think is, one of the reasons why people do subscribe to certain worldviews is because it's comforting when it comes to suffering, because it explains it. But I think the reality, like just from a purely like, not biased by any kind of religion thing, I think it's just random and we just don't know how to deal with that. And so we try to make up ways to cope with it.
In some ways, it speaks to our empathy as a species, right? Where it's just like, well, there's got to be a reason because the randomness of it all. We probably wouldn't care if we were a bit more sociopathic, right? We'd be like, yeah, it sucks to suck. but I think it's just kind of like a frustrating thing, not just when it happens to us, but some of my deepest pains haven't been things that have happened to me. It's been things that have happened to people I love.
Yeah.
And I think that's such an interesting thing. So yeah, I agree. I don't think there is a rhyme or reason, but goddamn, if I could find one, I feel like it would provide me some comfort. And it's not like when I was a Christian, I had a good answer for that question either. Because I mean, all you have to do in Christianity is say, well, why does God let that happen? And then it's even worse in some ways because you're like, yeah, he probably shouldn't be letting that happen, huh? What about this? Do you think it's possible to simply change your mindset about suffering? Because some people believe, the trope, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Can suffering be reframed as an opportunity for growth? I mean, we already kind of hinted at toxic positivity, so we don't want to do that. But can there be any kind of reframing as calling it an opportunity for growth that's good?
Yes, I definitely think so. That's the psychology of resilience, the ability to cope with, to handle suffering and to kind of come out on the other side, having learned something or having built some strength or at least at the very minimum, like having gotten through it. And that contributes um, to your view of yourself and your view of the world. I definitely think that it can be a positive thing. Again, not to say like, when I was a Christian, I was like, okay, I want to make myself suffer. I want to put myself in situations that'll make me suffer. So I don't believe in it that way anymore. But it's definitely an opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity to understand yourself more, which is definitely growth. It's an opportunity to understand others more, and that's an element of growth and an opportunity to build your own resilience. And there's a myriad of ways to do that. I don't think we'll ever run out you know, of opportunities to learn how to grow. And something that I think of too, like I think to myself, okay, suffering is inevitable. Okay, that's true. That's true. And I also think we never really arrive at like, okay, I've grown so much from this suffering, and I've done all the growing that I can. And I've just arrived at this place where, I have nothing left to learn. That's never going to happen. The only maybe slight exception of that I can think of, and I don't know much about this, is when Buddhists reach nirvana, because at that point, I mean, at least in their not theology, because it's not really theology, but in their worldview, like that's kind of arriving for them when they achieve nirvana. But again, like that all has to do with achieving nirvana has to do with resilience. It has to do with learning through suffering how to accept it and move on in a positive way. So, in short, yes, I definitely think suffering can be reframed in the mind as an opportunity for growth and positivity.
You say that so well, and it's like making me like die inside just because I'm like, I think I know that, but I don't feel it. You know what I mean? Because I mean I agree. I'm like, and I can even think of examples, even personal examples in my own life where I could reframe a suffer. The van life example I give all the time. I'm like, yeah, it was kind of like rock bottom, and it was like the most important rock bottom I ever hit. Like, it changed so much about who I am for the better. But I'm like, man, I just like when I'm experiencing suffering and someone's like, well, you just need to reframe it for as an opportunity for growth. I want to like vomit. Like, I'm like, go away.
Right. And there's definitely like a, yes, while suffering can be an opportunity for growth, yeah, suffering sucks. That's why it's suffering. So like we always have to be aware of that and like allow ourselves and others. That's an important thing too, because how you deal with suffering yourself is going to frame how you approach suffering when it's happening to others. But I think actually, now that I think about it, that's, I think, the biggest way that I view suffering as an opportunity for growth personally is that it helps me to understand others. So when I think of my health problems, or the fact that my parents are divorced, or the fact that I went through a divorce, or the fact that I, was in this religion that was very abusive to me and I left it, or, me like coming out as non-heterosexual. Like I think about all these things that have kind of caused me some kind of discomfort or suffering in my life. And I think, yeah, they really sucked. And during the moment, they were really sucking. But also in that suffering, I like unlocked this whole new way to understand other people and to relate to other people and to be truly empathetic to other people. Because now if somebody comes up to me and they're like, oh, well, I'm just, going through a divorce, my husband and I are splitting up, I instantly have a way of kind of understanding them more than I would if I hadn't been through one myself. So I'm not saying that's a good reason to like, decide to get divorced. Is like, oh, then I can help others who have been divorced. But that's something that I got out of it personally was, yeah, it sucked when it was happening. Ultimately, it was better for me, and I think better for both of us in the end. But a huge factor of that kind of got me through it, I think, was like, well, now I understand when other people are going through this. Like now I can really understand. Now I can really communicate with my mom more gently and more empathetically, because my mom's been divorced, my dad's been divorced. And so it really just opened up more opportunities for deep connection with other people.
Yeah, it can almost be like empathy training, right? It's funny you say that because I'm literally meeting up with someone right after this who's going through a divorce who reached out to me because she was like, "Did you go through a divorce?" I was like, "Yes." She's like, "Can I talk to you?" I'm like, "Yes." Because I mean, you and I both know that, like that there's kind of there's I joke there's almost a look divorce people can give each other that other people can't. It's almost like a shared, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost a shared cynicism. So I think about it sometimes, like they're like, oh my god, I just met someone so cute, and then the two divorced people look at each other like but
Yeah.
it's interesting you say that because how about when people you don't like suffer? Like, do you ever catch yourself delighting in suffering when someone it's kind of getting maybe something you might feel like they deserve, like Bezos getting divorced, or back when Trump got COVID, or our the president of Moody when he had to resign. like he was forced to resign. Like I would still argue all three of those things can fit into the category of suffering. Like I don't think it was like positive things those people were experiencing. Um, is it okay to kind of delight when people get suffering if you either don't like them or think they were doing wrong? Is that healthy or unhealthy? What are some of your thoughts?
I don't know if I can say if it's okay to do that or not. I don't know. I would have to ask my therapist if that's healthy or unhealthy. But I can say I have caught myself doing that. And I feel horrible saying that, which probably means that it's not very healthy. But I've found myself, not delighting in other people's suffering. Well, okay, yeah. I don't think that it's as much that I've been able to delight in other people's suffering as much as just kind of nod my head and say, that probably needed to happen. Like maybe that will humble them a little bit. Maybe that'll reframe how they see things a little bit. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I like am filled with delight when bad things happen to Donald Trump, but I'm not completely upset to hear about it because I'm like, well, it probably needed to happen.
Well, yeah, it doesn't have to be like an either or, I suppose. Like it can kind of just be neutral to, but I mean, I'll just be honest, like I catch myself like I had a shot when Nyquist resigned from Moody. Like I was like party, you
Yeah.
know. And part of it was in his case specifically, I didn't feel like he was suffering that much because I'm like, oh sweet, you got $1 million apartment basically, like,
Yeah.
but in the other examples, like I do find myself, I'm like, I know as a Christian, I would have felt like that's a bad feeling. Like that's like sin to like rejoice in anyone's suffering. I would have felt that way. And now
Yeah.
I don't know how I feel about that. I'm like, I more try to frame it as, is that healthy for me to like revel in someone else's suffering? And even if they are a, not great person for society. Um, and I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, John, that you said like that you think about it in terms of is it good, is it healthy for myself? Is it beneficial for me, or is it just like me kind of, indulging in like being angry or whatever? Yeah, I think something that makes a difference. So for example, when it comes to Nyquist or Trump, or I mean really any of the Bezos, any of the people that you mentioned, I think that I'm not to say that it makes it okay to rejoice in their suffering, but those people caused a lot of suffering. Those people have been directly or indirectly responsible for immense suffering of many people, way more than just their individual self. Like they've been responsible for a lot of suffering. So again, I think even though things like karma aren't built into like religious or like Christian worldviews, I think that we all know about karma. Like what goes around comes around. I think that's kind of why we have that reaction, because okay, this person is suffering. Well, they caused a lot of suffering, so of course the universe or whatever is going to come around and like give it back to them.
Yeah, I think that's completely valid. What about on a smaller scale? Like maybe it's just like someone you and I don't like from Bible college who was a jerk in Bible college, and then they, are suffering. Like, is it more complicated when the like scale of harm is a lot less?
I'd say it's similar in that, so they didn't cause suffering. I'm thinking of a certain person, and I feel bad that I'm thinking of a certain person in Bible college, but, this person may not have caused like wide, like, global suffering or, national suffering, but they definitely have been instrumental in the suffering of myself and a couple other people that I know who I care a lot about. So in that case, yes, it's a smaller scale, but it's the same kind of, I think, paradigm. Like somebody caused me or somebody that I care about or a lot of people to suffer. And now they're suffering. Like it's kind of like, okay, maybe this will knock them down a couple notches, or maybe this will help them to interact better with others. Yeah, but I mean, yeah. In response to your question, I still feel that way about on a smaller scale too, about people who have personally hurt me. If something bad happens to them, but again, I think for me, it's especially with people who I've been close with before personally, because I understand their humanity and like the fact that they're just like me and they've just done some things I don't like. It's easier for me to less of a rejoicing and more of a like, well, that's really shitty that they're going through that. But okay, now maybe they'll understand a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that closeness is actually worth pointing out because, like I don't wish anything bad on my ex-wife, right? Like, and I'm like, because there was just so much love there at one point. And I think that like that can point to kind of like the more distance there is, maybe even the more okay it is, because it's not as much like a you're not necessarily confronting your soul on something, right?
I mean, like with, people with big figures, like world figures, like Trump. Like I don't know him personally, so it's really hard for me to kind of see his humanity unless I really sit and think about it, because I haven't sat there and had like, an actual talk with him. I haven't connected with him. But then when I think about people that I've interacted with, the people I think that hurt us the most are the people that we're actually like, pretty close with, at least at some point. So when I think about the people who have hurt me in the past, like people from Bible college or ex relationships, things like that. It really is much easier for me to like feel compassion for them when they suffer. And again, there might be some kind of like, ooh, well, now they're going through it too. Like, but I almost say that in like a familial way towards them, where I'll be like, okay, like they're going through this. It really sucks. I know it sucks. Maybe this will help them to understand how they hurt me, or maybe this will help them to like, moving forward, like be more empathetic with others. Because yeah, there's definitely a tenderness there. Like even the people at Bible college who caused me a lot of psychological and emotional trauma, um, what I really want for them is for them to be happy and like liberated from, the viewpoint that caused them to hurt me so badly. So there's compassion there, which is different from when it's, a figure that I've never interacted with.
Well put. And I think there's room for recognizing our humanity and whatever feelings may come, and also room for like exploring, like, why do I react this way when I hear this news? And just, being open to whatever comes. And I don't think there's like necessarily like a dead on right or wrong answer to it. Speaking let's shift to like back to this Christianity that's given us all these problems. Do well, let's start positive. What do you think Christians get right about suffering, if anything?
I do appreciate, and I still kind of utilize this in my like worldview, that suffering is an opportunity for us to come together, for us, as a community to help out. There are better ways to do this than others. So just saying thoughts and prayers is like not a very actionable thing. But like I mean, I've experienced in my community, my hometown, in which I'm living right now, which is very Christian. They'll come around a family that's suffering, and they'll bring them meals. They'll donate to their GoFundMe. They'll give them rides. They'll help babysit their kids. Whatever. Like they're I think some Christians, a lot of Christians, to be honest, really know how to come around as a community and support people when they're suffering. So I think that's a very positive thing, that I appreciate. It's one of the few things that I really do like really appreciate about the Christian community. I think that's helpful. And I think that some Christians see suffering as an opportunity for growth personally. Again, it might not be framed in like a personal growth, like a, psychological or therapeutic mindset. But, when I was a Christian, and I would, write my blog posts and stuff about suffering, I would always kind of end, like when I would say God is good and stuff like that, I would actually feel a little bit better. And I'd feel like, okay, I've gotten through this emotion, like, and I do think that that was a positive thing, rather than because I didn't personally really try to avoid the suffering. I leaned into it, and I think that that teaching in Christianity is positive because, I don't know. I know a lot of Christians who, I mean, I don't know if I can say that it's like, in the Bible as a directive, but I know a lot of Christians who do encourage themselves and others to like lean into suffering. And I think that's something that's really healthy psychologically.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. And another thing that comes to mind, I've been my mentor Bob Spintana. He's a religious reporter and he's Christian, and he's great, love him. But he wrote a book called Reorganize Religion, where he talks about how religion, not just Christianity, but religion is such a like load bearing wall when it comes to like disaster relief.
Mm.
I feel like because there's like, I guess, less bureaucratic red tape than some like nonprofits, like Christians just show up like when like a tornado hits or something. Like they're just there ready to help. And like they are better at organizing than non-religious people. I mean, just objectively looking at it, right? There could be some problematic reasons they're better at organizing, but it's still a fact. And so yeah, I think about that too, that just kind of like there's a shared community of suffering in some sense that I think that I miss, to be frank. It's one of the only things I miss about the faith is this idea of I don't have like a weekly group of people that I can kind of unload onto and they actually will take it on. Now, let me ask this question that will kind of invalidate that what I just said. What are some of the most harmful things that Christians say when someone is suffering?
Oh, there's a lot of them. um, the first things that come to mind are like, God has a plan for this. You know, there's a reason behind this. God doesn't do anything without a reason. God's got this, things like that. It could be worse. I mean, variations of saying that, like maybe they won't say it could be worse, but like, I don't know, the whole, at least it's not this kind of thing. I think that people say that, like they have like, you know, a good, they're well intentioned sometimes, like trying to, you know, comfort them, like, well, it could be worse. But I think that's actually a really toxic thing to say. You know, use this as an opportunity to get closer to God, or, you know, use this as an opportunity to really lean into your faith. And there's a lot of kind of Christianese, and a lot of things I just said are like Christianese, like God's got this, things like that. I hear people say that all of the time. And that doesn't really make any sense if you just take that sentence and you're just like, okay, what is this claiming? Like, it doesn't really make God's got this. Like, what do you mean? Like,
Yeah, one of the ones that comes to mind that I heard a lot was what do you think God is trying to teach you right now? And
yeah,
it's like
yeah,
I'm like I don't know, but I don't want to learn it. Like it's like
yeah. There's a lot of tone deaf things that people say, like, okay, in reality, is that a good thing to sit and think about? Yes. But when somebody's acutely suffering, like pretty much anything that you can say is not going to be the right thing, because when somebody's like acutely suffering, really often what they really need is for you to just say, yeah, that sucks. I'm here. Like, I'm here for you. Like I'm, you know, I understand you. I see you. Like, we want that validation. And I think a lot of people try to just jump in and like provide solutions where, you know, in any kind of suffering, in any kind of religion, any kind of situation, oftentimes people don't want like solutions. They just want to be like, this sucks. And, you know, I want to feel loved.
yeah, and I feel like non-Christians do that too. So, like I mean, I remember going through my divorce and just hear it, I don't know if you had a similar experience or not, but man, people just said all the worst things when I was going through divorce. Who were not all of them were even Christians. They just would always like you know, a big one. I try to tell people this all the time. A big thing people would say to me, and this is like raw, right? When they're telling me this, they're going, well, at least you didn't have kids. And it's such a trope. I'm like, don't tell people who are going through divorce, at least you don't have kids if they don't have kids. Because it's very possible, and it was in my scenario at the time, I really wanted kids. So that was like a really hard thing to just remind me of while I'm going through a divorce. And like there's just little things like that. But I don't know. I feel like the Christians were worse. Do you feel like they're worse at that than the non-Christians?
Oh yeah, I think so. And I think because they tie it into Christianity and they tie it into trusting God. Whereas, you know, when non-Christian people would say things, yeah, like when I was going through my divorce, like, oh well, like fuck that guy, you know, like the things that they thought would be, you know, good things to say, or like at least you didn't have kids, like those things weren't tied in at all with Christianity. So I think it was a little bit easier for me to like get past them because I'm just like, whatever. But then when Christians come in and give their statements and their 2 cents about it, it always has to do with God, or with like, you know, your faith, or with God's suffering or God's plan. And when you tie it into something that, like when I was a Christian, like that was so intertwined with like my mind and my soul and the way that I operated, that like if you're calling in my faith like against me right now, like if you're like minimizing my suffering on the basis of this worldview that I've made my own, like that just seems even way more of a dick move. Like, Because that would make me have more of an emotional response. And like there's like a shame response there too, right? Like when people say things like, well, it's for the better, that person was horrible, that doesn't really elicit like a shame response within you. But when people say to you like, well, God has a plan, it's like they're chiding you and making you try to feel shame or guilt for not trusting God enough. And that hurts worse, personally.
Completely agree. There's almost like a judgment I feel that happens, right? Because most evangelical Christians would not agree with the doctrine that if you're suffering, it's because you did something wrong.
Yeah.
That's like a misconception, I think, from outsiders. I'm like, no, evangelicals don't explicitly teach that. But the way
Hmm.
they frame things, it feels like you did something wrong when
Yeah.
you are suffering. And I think that I don't know how much is intentional or an accident, but I can think of many times in my life where it
Yeah.
felt like I was being judged more than loved when I was suffering.
Yes, for sure.
All right, let me get really brutal here. I tend
Wow.
to think that the word suffering is sometimes used like so generally so that the specifics don't have to be addressed. So they'll label divorce as suffering, the death of a loved one is suffering, health issues are suffering. All of this is suffering, and it seems like a way to just make it fit into a broader theology while like ignoring like systemic or circumstantial reasons that people are suffering. So
Hmm.
that way Christians don't actually have to do anything to help anyone. They can just make it like part of their theological framework. Am I too cynical in accusing them of that?
No, I don't think so. I think I would think the same way. And like we've said a couple times throughout this podcast so far, suffering is inevitable, but that isn't like a blanket statement to to explain suffering. The fact that it's inevitable isn't a good enough reason to ignore the reasons behind it or the impacts of suffering. And I do think that Christians specifically are guilty of using their definition of suffering in order to, um, what's the word, to offload the responsibility. So, for example, if they say, "Oh, well, that's that's life," or like, um, you're going through suffering, which obviously just means that like always, you need Jesus. We need Jesus. I think Christians often deflect responsibility just straight off to God. So, no, I don't think that's cynical that you said that, because I would agree. If people just say like, "Oh, God help these people who are suffering," then they don't have to do anything more than that. That's why the whole thoughts and prayers thing rubs a lot of people the wrong way, because that's not really doing anything to help. And Christians depend a lot on prayers and on offloading responsibility to their higher power. Um, and I think that's kind of atrocious that they do that, because in a lot of cases of suffering, there are tangible ways that you can help, or there are ways that you're causing it. And so you need to modify what you're doing. And I think Christians have a knack for just deflecting that responsibility.
Totally agree, especially on that latter bit about how much harm they cause because several things come to mind. One more just kind of current social issue is this idea of like of just I don't know, it's a little chicken and egg. I don't know which precedes which, but because they have this kind of general framework, like if someone's talking about like racism, they're like, well, I understand that black people suffer, but we all suffer. And then it's just like immediately back to the gospel. And there's like no actual
Yeah.
thing done about the issue. And that's across the board with like civil rights for minorities of any kind.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of it's just such a wall. And again, I can never tell whether it's like the theology just brainwashing them or if it's like they're using the theology to justify their racism. It's sometimes I don't know which is which.
Hmm.
um for me personally, I feel like I was brainwashed, right? Like I feel like when I was at my most bigoted, it was because I was brainwashed by theology, because my personhood doesn't feel natural to me. So I don't know, but who knows with other generations. The other thing they'll do, and this is like big time like pet peeve soapbox territory, when they dismiss people who either take a break from church or leave church or stop being Christian, when they describe it as because of church hurt. That phrase makes me want to just punch something, because I'm like, I didn't leave because of just a little church hurt. And it feels very dismissive. Like, it's like, well, church hurt. What do you mean church hurt? Like, you mean the people in the church that hurt me? There was one time I was at a coffee shop and this guy came up. I have a nice computer. So he was asking me questions about my computer, and he asked me what I was working on. I was like, my podcast. And then I told him about the podcast, and he goes, oh, and so I can immediately tell on his face. I'm like, oh, this is a Christian. And he goes, well, he says, he said, like, I found that, like, because I was talking about, he asked me, like, he's like, oh, were you hurt by the church? And I kind of like was like, okay, I'll say yes and approach it from that angle for now. And so I did, and he goes, well, I've just found that, like, the church can hurt, but it's really about the people. And I just looked at him and I went, well, I thought the people were the church. And then he goes, huh, yeah. Well, it was nice talking to you. He walked away.
Yeah.
I was like, what a classic, right? Like, I'm just like, it felt so like a summation of how they don't understand that, no, I'm actually saying you're causing the harm, not just that suffering is coming from this. They frame suffering as coming from, like, the world or sin or just anything but them. And I find that, like, really annoying, frankly.
I completely agree. And what you were just saying reminded me of back like a couple years ago. I wrote, I posted it on my Instagram, but that's the only place I posted it on, like on a story. So it's not even on there for anybody to see. But I wrote an open letter to anyone who has asked me or will ask me in the future why I left Christianity. Because, what you said about people, claiming that it's, because of being hurt by the church. And that's just like a gross oversimplification. Is it okay if I just read part of this?
Do it. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, I wrote, please stop asking this question of me or of anyone. For me, the decision was based on experiences both within and around me that transpired over the course of 2 decades. And to reduce that experience, that trauma, to a digestible and one sitting answer would be to falsely represent reality in order to accommodate your comfort. Even if I were to come up with some condensed and honest response, it would be helpful to neither me nor you, and I wouldn't be fully representing my experience. And your limited understanding would lead you to oversimplify what is an infinitely nuanced situation. Contrary to what you might think, people don't leave behind an entire ancestral religion due to simple, isolated incidents. Every part of my life has led me to this place, so to blame my agnosticism on things like my divorce or my physical health or my secular bachelor's degree is a gross and unjust oversimplification.
Thanks for coming on. I can't end any stronger than that. That was so well put. So well put. Yeah, just wow. I always forget what an amazing writer you are. Holy shit. Yeah, I can't say anything more. So we'll just end here. Mylee, thank you for coming back on. Is there anything, either resources that you do you want anyone to follow you? Do you want them to leave you alone? Or do you just have any, like, kind of parting thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, or at least mention the psychology of resilience. In terms of suffering, like if people who are listening to this are experiencing suffering, or, so everybody, because everybody is experiencing suffering in some capacity. Something that's really helped me in my journey over the past several years move from the paradigm of I can only get through suffering with God to where I am now, which is that, I have the power to cope with things as they come. And I've just been able to process through a lot of my own things. And a big part of that has been that I've kind of started to scratch the surface of the psychology of resilience. So resilience is our ability to bounce back from things like stressors or life events, or just to handle everyday things. And I think that's a growing field of psychology. I took an entire class on it when I was in college, because if it is inevitable that everybody suffers, then yes, we need to be figuring out how we can reduce suffering on like a national level and on a personal level. But I think the most important thing to focus on is our personal response to it. So we've touched on this a little bit throughout the podcast, but if you are suffering, if you're listening right now and you're going through things and you don't know how to handle it, I can just strongly recommend, for one, therapy. It has been very helpful for me. And also just Google the psychology of resilience. There's a lot of good scholarly and, pop culture articles out there right now that offer a lot of everything from stress management skills to coping with severe trauma. So there's a lot of resources out there. I can't provide any specific ones. I'm not a therapist myself, but I do wellness coaching with some clients at my job. So a big thing we talk about is stress management and resilience. So that's kind of just my little parting 2 cents about suffering.
Awesome. Yeah, and even in that same vein, I can recommend the book The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. It's essentially just like a pop culture way of saying the same thing. And it's very good, and it helped me a lot too. Also, Super You by Emily V. Gordon puts all of this in the category of you being a superhero, and it's very fun. And it's especially great if you like more fun reads rather than kind of drags. So yeah, great. Mylee, thank you for coming back on. I can't wait for you to come back. You are infinitely articulate and one of my favorite people. So thank you.
Awesome. It was so great to be on, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.
Yeah, it'll be fun. All right. And I'll talk to the rest of y'all very soon. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.